Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome Neelam Srivastava, who is a professor of postcolonial and world literature at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom, and works on many different topics, such as the cultural history of Italian colonialism, postcolonial South Asian literature, anti-colonial and anti-fascist writing, and postcolonial print cultures. And today she's going to give us an insight into her work on Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and its impact on global print culture. And I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Please, Neelam.
Thank you so much, Johanna. And thank you so much for this really kind invitation and really welcome invitation to share my work. So I think I'll start and I will share my screen. Hoping that, hoping that it works. Second. Share screen. The title of my talk is Unbinding Ethiopia, Ethiopia in Global Print Cultures. And the premise to what I'm about to say is that in 1935, fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia, an independent sovereign state governed by the Emperor Haile Selassie and a member of the League of Nations since 1923. It was one of the last colonial wars of conquest ever fought in the world. The project I would like to speak about today, which I am developing with Dr. Jack Webb at Manchester University, examines how the event's lasting impact on Ethiopia, global diasporic communities, the European public sphere, and colonial geopolitics was shaped and mediated by the print cultures that proliferated around the world in the wake of the invasion. But before delving into the specifics of the project, I would like to offer a reflection on the term postcolonial print cultures. In our recent co-edited volume, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Postcolonial Print Cultures, edited by myself, Toral Gajarawala, Raji Sundarajan, and Jack Webb, we define postcolonial print cultures as the published and unpublished writing, magazines, pamphlets, paratexts, advertisements, cartoons, radio, and street art that served as the intellectual force behind opposition to colonial orders, as meditations on the futures of embryonic nation states, and as visions of new forms of equality. The texts that make up postcolonial print cultures are often found outside the archival catalog and in more haphazard repositories, such as personal collections, the streets, or as appendages to established collections. They are therefore ephemeral, provisional, and in many cases subversive, occupying a unique position both in postcolonial studies and in book history. These print cultures are necessarily anti-institutional. They serve as a counterpoint to the colonial archive and relatedly to more traditional genres and text formats coming out of large-scale publishers. Many of these print productions articulate collective liberation projects with origins in the grassroots. They include debates around the shape of the postcolonial nation and the new state formation that necessarily draw on a diverse and contentious public sphere of opinion. And I will return to this question of contentiousness in the public sphere. A key focus of our investigation into postcolonial print cultures is the relationship between the ostensibly demarcated spheres of the literary and the political. Prevailing models of world literature are marked by a privileging of the literary over the political. Pascal Casanova has influentially argued that, quote, the autonomy enjoyed by the most literary countries is marked chiefly by the depoliticization of literature, the almost complete disappearance of popular or national themes, the appearance of pure writing, texts that, freed from the obligation to help to develop a particular national identity, have no social or political function. And as an aspect of this, the emergence of formal experimentation, which is to say, forms detached from political purpose and unencumbered by non-literary conceptions of literature, end of quote. And I'm quoting from Casanova here. Casanova's analysis seems remarkably oblivious to the commercial pressures placed on contemporary literary writing by the hegemony of Anglophone global publishing conglomerates. In contrast, our project trains its gaze on a different kind of temporality. namely on short-lived, topical, and politically oriented literature, often produced with little to no infrastructure. By eschewing a fixation with formal and, quote, universal literary values, we aim to revalue the contingent and political imperatives of a historical moment to work towards a different kind of literary positioning from that of Casanova. Such an emphasis also aims to offer a response, a riposte actually, to the center-periphery model, shifted instead to the South-South alliances that permitted the formation of a literary international in the interwar period of the 20th century. And central to this idea of a post-colonial literary international is the role of translation and multilingualism, which helps us move beyond the dominant Anglophone genres of post-colonial writing, such as the novel. And of course, this is the focus of this online seminar series organized and hosted by the University of Freiburg. When examining print culture produced during the period of decolonization, it is often impossible to disengage discussion of political and social debates from debates about form. So, unlike, again, moving away from Casanova, for us, for this project, form is inseparable from politics. Form is malleable. It encompasses genre, format, the visible or material shape of how texts, anthologies, or magazines are presented and structured, as well as personal style. As Caroline Levine argues, literary forms can exercise a political power. So traditionally, we would tend to see how literature talks about politics, but actually literature can shape politics as well. It's not just an inert container for political themes. And this is the case for this heterogeneous print archive produced in the wake of anti-colonial revolutions and emerging nation states that sought to achieve freedom from Western hegemony. Form thus shaped the way in which important political and ideological messages were conveyed to national and international audiences. Forms are also formats, namely the material shape taken by texts within the constraints of their physical production. Forms are molded, serialized, and shortened, i.e. formatted to the layout of the journal or magazine in which they appear. Periodical culture is crucial to the textual construction of liberation and resistance discourses in the interwar period, and in general, as we know, is a key platform for political debates, thanks to the fertile cross-pollination of ideas between writers, editors, and readers. So, moving back to the topic of my talk, namely the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was one of the top 10 news stories of 1935. And in the run-up of Italy's invasion of the country, Addis Ababa, the capital, was overrun with foreign journalists anxious to get the scoop on the most exciting international event of the year. As Evelyn Waugh, who covered the war for the Daily Mail, remarked, Abyssinia was news. Everyone with any claim to African experience was cashing in. And his famous novel, Scoop, is based on a fictional land called Ismailia, but really it's based on his experiences as a war correspondent in Ethiopia at the time. The project I'm working on aims to document the invasion in global print culture in the period between the two wars. By considering in detail the print activism around the war, the project investigates the variety of popular and elite responses to empire acts of imperial aggression across a range of metropolitan and colonial sites: Italy, Ethiopia, Great Britain, the United States, the Caribbean, and West Africa. The focus on the Italian invasion rethinks the impact of Black and colonized voices in the shaping of global public opinion about empire. And the project builds on recent work around the flow of progressive and radical ideas from the colonies to the metropole, thinking of the work of Leela Gandhi and Priyambada Gopal, and the concept of so-called reverse tutelage or reverse civilizing mission. However, it goes beyond the prevalently monodirectional idea of reverse intellectual flows to investigate the role of transnational and transimperial networks in opposition to empire, aiming to offer a more multi-textured version of anti-colonial histories and cultures. How are colonial subjects and anti-colonial activists in conversation, say, with Ethiopians themselves? how do their varying forms of resistance reconcile with one another or even act in competing ways? The project reconfigures the notion of Eurocentrism in the study of empire and resistance. The dialogical dynamics that take place between political activists via the rich material of print culture, including newspapers, ephemera, letters, manifestos, political writings, literature, journalistic reportages, allows us to present a picture of so-called interlocutory cultures binding Ethiopia and its supporters and detractors together, beyond the binaries of us, them, or colonizer, colonized. How are Ethiopians affecting British, Italian, Afro-diasporic views of their own country and the conflict taking place there? I'm thinking of Sylvia Pankhurst's broadsheet, New Times in Ethiopia News, which acted as an Anglophone mouthpiece for the Ethiopian role of family and the Ethiopian resistance, and I'll be talking about this a bit later on in the talk. As Shumeishi argues, quote, a true anti-Eurocentrism should scatter all centers rather than replace one center with another, end of quote. Ethiopia was itself an important empire in the East African region and was ruled by the Amhara elite through the despotic figure of Haile Selassie, so that the idea of Ethiopia as a victim country is complicated by its own history of imperialism in the region and within the confines of the nation state. Print culture networks allow us to retrieve a powerful Ethiopian voice that was silenced or ignored by many world leaders in the public sphere. Maza Mengista's recent novel, published in 2019, The Shadow King, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, establishes the literary value of anti-colonial Ethiopian narratives that rewrite the history of this long-forgotten war for a contemporary readership. A focus on oppositional print cultures around the invasion helps us to retrieve an alternative history of the war that was already being articulated by anti-colonial and anti-fascist activists. This retrieval, in turn, allows us to show that alternative historiographies of empire are available in the resistance archives of the Black diaspora and anti-fascist political actors. And so the methodology we are adopting to study this material is to read these texts and materials in relation to one another, in relation to other reading and writing publics, such as those, for example, that were favorable to Mussolini's invasion, Italian Americans or pro-American British, pro-Italian British authors, such as Yves Lenoir. Yves Lenoir was very pro-Mussolini. He was in favor of the invasion. He supported Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. So by looking at these materials together, it will generate new insights, we hope, into both resistance and imperialism, recuperating histories of allyship and emphasizing the non-binary relationships between colonizer and colonized across the imperial divide. Print cultures, we argue, offers an exceptional way to understand how these trans-imperial networks operated, given its informal and collaborative features. Ephemera, newspapers, magazines circulate as less formalized print objects than books, and they're cheaper often. They can pass from hand to hand. And this in turn facilitates a huge range of insights into the global response to the Italian-Ethiopian War. Alongside what is more conventionally understood as print culture, the project examines cultural artifacts such as novels and poems produced around the war, with the aim to break down the barrier between the supposed non-literary and literary texts, emphasizing the continuity and disruption of narratives across diverse print formats. The project highlights the transnational dimensions of anti-colonialism and resistance. It recenters the history of anti-fascism around the Italian invasion of Ethiopia as a pivotal event and focus for political activism. Much of the scholarship on interwar anti-fascism has tended to focus on the Spanish Civil War as a precursor, right, to the resistance to Nazi fascism during the Second World War. But this war was more forgotten, the Ethiopian invasion. And in doing so, the project aims to decolonize a primarily white history of activism and engagement against fascism. It aims to blacken, so to speak, the history of anti-fascist movements by highlighting the political contribution of Black public intellectuals and grassroots activists to these movements. The project will reconstruct the immensely widespread impact of the invasion by reconstructing the accounts available in global print cultures across a variety of geographical and symbolic sites, which correspond to different networks of readers. Writers, and publics. And in what remains of my talk, I'd like to give you a few examples of the kinds of public spheres that and readerships and materials that the project engages with. The first one I want to talk about is the print impact of the war on Ethiopia. And what you see in the photograph to your right is a collection of pamphlets and manifestos launched from English planes on Amhara territories during the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. Numerous print artifacts, namely for British and Ethiopian propaganda leaflets launched from planes, or Italian fascist publications aimed at active servicemen and colonists in Italian East Africa, reconstruct the history of the war in Ethiopia itself and its importance for national self-identity in the wake of the invasion and the prolonged war of resistance against fascist Italy. The British, and here the British play a key role, the aerei inglesi, these are British planes that launched the leaflets. The British played a sort of double game at the time of the invasion. On the one hand, the British did not actively oppose the entry of Italian troops into the sovereign territory of Haile Selassie's empire, which was then known to many as Abyssinia. This was despite the fact that it was a sovereign territory. The secret Hors-Laval Pact, agreed in 1935 between Britain and France, had initially proposed partitioning Ethiopia in the wake of the invasion, handing much of it over to Italy. But due to outraged public opinion in Britain, this pact never came into existence. At the same time, Italy did continue to occupy Ethiopia and ended up using poison gas against the civilian population. When Haile Selassie fled the country as the Italian troops advanced, Britain hosted him in exile. He spent 5 years with his family in Fairfield House in Bath, hosted by His Majesty's government and supported by a wide array of sympathizers, ranging from the nonpartisan Abyssinia Association to the much more radical figure of Sylvia Pankhurst, to the Pan-Africanist solidarity of notable Caribbean intellectuals such as C.L.R. James and George Padmore, and also African intellectuals such as Kwame Nkrumah, all of whom were residing in London at the time. The British, while playing this double game, also actively aided the Ethiopian resistance against the Italians, and this intensified once the Second World War broke out and East Africa became an important theater of military operations against the Axis powers. So to return to the print impact of the war on Ethiopia, what you see in the slides here is a collection of pamphlets launched from English planes that were aiding the Ethiopian war effort against the Italian occupation. They are dated roughly, sorry, I'll just go back a second. They're dated roughly 1940 to 1942 and appear to be a sort of periodical bulletin, originally published in Amharic, targeted at the Amharic population of Ethiopia to turn them against the Italians and join the Ethiopian resistance. And ostensibly, the leaflets were authored by the emperor himself. As these pamphlets rained down on the Ethiopian territories from the sky, they were intercepted by the Italian occupying forces, collected into a sort of scrapbook, and translated into Italian. And this collection of writing is currently located in the Biblioteca Nazionale di Roma, the National Library of Rome, in the Isiao section in the collection of material donated to the National Library by the Italian Institute for Orient and Africa. And these documents actually come from the older colonial museum that was part of the Ministry of the Colonies in Italy. What we see at work here, and here I'm returning to the question of translation, is how translation is being used as a form of counterintelligence by the Italians to decipher and thus counteract this airborne propaganda by the enemy forces represented by British aviation and the Ethiopian royal family. So to the left, you have the Amharic pamphlet, and to the right, you have the Italian translation. Here is one brief excerpt from the Italian translation. The title of the bulletin was Our Flag. So it's translated, I don't read Amharic, I'm reading from the Italian. To the right, you see La Nostra Bandiera, which means, of course, our flag in Italian. And it's dated Khartoum, November 1940, and it's authored ostensibly by Haile Selassie. By June 1940, Haile Selassie had moved from Bath to Khartoum in the Sudan to aid the British war effort against the Italians in Ethiopia. He wrote from this location. He begins the pamphlet by mentioning Italy's recent invasion of Greece and encouraging King George II in the Allied fight against the Axis powers. He also praises the Greek soldiers' valor in the face of the Italian aggression. He then continues. See if I, stay on this slide, sorry. This is in the pamphlet itself. When Italy began the war against Ethiopia, it promised to civilize the population. Now, with its attempt to invade Greece, which has been the mother of civilization for so many thousands of years, Italy is revealed as a looter, as a rapinatrice, a sort of thief, I guess, who doesn't give a toss about civilization. Much of Italy's war propaganda around the invasion centered on its civilizing mission towards Ethiopia, which was seen as a barbaric kingdom where slavery was still practiced and which was governed by a despotic emperor. On October 28th, 1940, just a few days before the dating of this pamphlet, Benito Mussolini had invaded northern Greece from Albania, which was at that time under Italian control. Although greatly outnumbered, within a month, the Greek army had pushed the Italians back into Albania. But if Greece, considered the cradle of European civilization, was being invaded by Italy, then all claims on the part of Italy to a civilizing mission towards its territories it was occupying, including Ethiopia, evidently fell apart. So what we see at work here is a refutation of the civilizing mission, of the imperialist claims of the Italians by saying, well, they've just invaded Greece, so they don't really have a leg to stand on. This artifact provokes questions about the method of analysis of post-colonial print cultures, the role of translation in counterintelligence, presumably by an Italian interpreter in the army who knew Amharic very well, the construction of an audience via airborne clandestine means. So the readership is literally being constructed when they receive the leaflets, when they get hold of a leaflet. It also makes us think about an anti-colonial consciousness and the revival through textuality of an Ethiopian nationalist sentiment that had been suppressed by the Italian population. And notably, the presentation of Italy's colonial war project as an act of savagery, not civilization. The collection of pamphlets in the Biblioteca Nazionale, in the National Laboratory, also includes some leaflets written in Italian and not Amharic, aimed at Italians living in Ethiopia and presumably composed by the Allies and the Emperor. It urges the Italians to stop fighting on the Italian side, as it was losing the war and was besieged at its borders by a great army. And I quote from the leaflet, "You are living like half-dead people in dead cities, surrounded by profoundly inimical population, facing on your borders the most formidable and well-armed forces that Africa has ever seen." It calls fascism an already dishonored cause at the end of the leaflet. It's clear that the anti-Italian propaganda was aiming to target settlers and colonized populations alike, cleverly deploying alternate linguistic registers, Amharic and Italian. I would like to turn now to the second example of print cultures and their translational role, which we see at work in the British public sphere. So we're moving now from Ethiopia to Britain, the second example, and how the British public sphere received news of the invasion and how they reacted. And generally, what is really striking about the reaction of the British to Italy's invasion in 1935 was their widespread support for Ethiopia against Italy. So some of the materials that we're looking at are the analysis of British newspapers, such as the Times, Punch cartoons. Here we have a pamphlet from the League of Nations Union. Several years before the outbreak of World War II, which laid bare the aggressive tendencies of Italy in East Africa, the support for Ethiopia on the part of ordinary British citizens belonging to the greatest empire on earth at the time suggests that an emerging humanitarian discourse is beginning to supplant outright imperialist sentiments that were invested in the British Empire. The support for Ethiopia in Britain registers a crisis of empire, but possibly at a subconscious level, by displacing the seeds of doubt about the civilizing mission onto a lesser or minor colonizing power, Italy, whose civilized European credentials are much less sturdy than those of Northern European empires such as Britain and France. But support for Ethiopia was not limited to intellectuals and political activists in Britain. And here you can see this pamphlet itself. Many people in Britain criticized its lack of support for the League of Nations sanctions against Italy and urged the British government to do the right thing by Ethiopia. Imperialism, in other words, was beginning to seem like a form of barbarism, a notion that became more generally widespread in the 30s than in earlier periods. See, for example, this cartoon from Punch, reproduced in the above-mentioned pamphlet. An Ethiopian is fleeing in the deadly mist of the poison gas that the Italian army dropped on unarmed Ethiopian civilians in the course of the conflict. The dawn of progress, but how am I to see it? They've blinded me. And this was a mainstream publication, so it wasn't just niche left-wing publications. This circulated very widely in the public sphere. The transnational anti-fascist and anti-colonial counterpublic, exemplified by Sylvia Panker's publication, New Times and Ethiopian News, that was a key mobilizer of transnational public opinion against Ethiopia, is also a precious archive of anti-colonial African, Asian, and Caribbean voices. They denounced the use of poison gas and functioned also as an unofficial mouthpiece for the Ethiopian royal family that was in exile in Bath as guests of His Majesty's government. And also it put the focus on fascism more broadly, so it routinely carried photographs and evidence of fascist atrocities, including those happening in Spain, as you can see from the photo. This is an image of Ethiopian guerrilla fighters in a pamphlet, again, produced by New Times and Ethiopian News. It also, as I said just now, it documented the use of poison gas on the part of the Italians. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war, and obviously this included the use of poison gas. In this slide, we see the feet of an Ethiopian person covered in blisters, which were caused by the gas. The photo was published in the broadsheet as evidence of Italian war crimes well before Italy's entry into World War II. And again, it's that ironic use of the word civilization. The symbol of fascist civilization is actually feet burnt by the gas. So these facts were well known to the British population, even beyond the more niche audiences of Panker's publication, because it routinely carried notices about these atrocities. So we've already seen two sort of slightly different public spheres where the impact of the event is being recorded. I now turn to my third example. Sorry, here are more slides from New Times and Ethiopian News. I now turn to my third example, Italian print cultures, popular culture, and fascist propaganda, where the war was a pivotal event in Italian fascist culture. It aimed to present Italians as virile conquerors whose brand of colonialism was both markedly different from other European colonial projects, but also aimed to compete with them. Reading Italian pro-racist publications of the time, such as La difesa della razza, The Defense of the Race, first published in 1938, 3 years after the invasion, the association of racial superiority with the ability to produce a civilization acquires parodic and increasingly unconvincing dimensions. It's not intentionally parodic, of course. This was considered like a serious publication. Indeed, the subtitle is Science, Documentation, and Debate. Scienza, Documentazione, Polemica. But as we can see from this photograph, we see the different so-called racial traits of Africans, Jews, and classical Romans, and it's separated by a sword. It's almost as if the racial imaginary conjured up by fascism is finally revealing its grotesque, unreal underpinnings. What may have been hidden within a more benign-seeming colonial discourse, sheltered by the much-touted democracy of liberal empires, is now laid bare. The racialist discourse at the heart of European nation-states becomes increasingly shrill through its fascist avatar, as its non-European opponents acquire strength and vigor in their discursive opposition to colonialism. So there's a sense of being cornered almost, that empire is really almost drawing to a close. So as I said, the brand of colonialism that Italy was trying to promote at the time of the invasion wanted to mark it as different from other colonial projects, but it also was in active competition with these other colonial projects. And here I'll show you an example from the Italian newspaper La Tradotta Coloniale, which was aimed at Italian troops heading for the Ethiopian front. And it was an anti-English cartoon. So part of the racialization of Italians in the course of the war was also about presenting themselves as anti-English. So there's a ton of anti-English propaganda going on in these publications. Here, the British are being condemned as hypocritical. They're being seen as hypocritical because they're condemning the Italian invasion, but at the same time, who are they to throw the first stone? After all, they represent the biggest empire on earth, involved in many colonial wars, such as the one in Afghanistan, and were instructing the massacre of many colonized populations. So the dialogue is between an English civil servant and a minister. Your Excellency, have you finished preparing that speech towards Italy's aggression towards poor Abyssinia? And the English minister, not yet. I need to write the orders for the massacre of the Afghans. On the next slide, we see the cover of the same newspaper, La Tradotta Coloniale, dated June 20th, 1936. So the invasion at that point, the conquest of Ethiopia, had now been sort of completed, quote unquote. On May 6th, 1936, Benito Mussolini announced the end of the war, though, of course, much resistance continued against the Italians on Ethiopian territory. What we see in this image is an Ethiopian man instructing a child and pointing to the hydraulic dam built by the Italians in Ethiopia, saying to him, remember that only he who can conquer the elements has the right to be called a man. La Tradotta Coloniale, aimed at Italian troops preparing to travel to the African front, worked towards a speedy, crude colonial indoctrination and into transforming these Italians from poor, illiterate, and underprivileged, really subalterns, who were sort of turning to military service out of necessity in a largely unknown, uncharted territory like Ethiopia. They were trying to turn them into would-be imperialists, imbued with the fervor and zeal of their civilizing mission. So they're trying to sort of create colonizing subjects. So sort of nearing the end here now, I'm just going to end with my final example. So obviously, these have been examples relating mainly to, I suppose, I mean, not exactly white authored publications, because of course the leaflets thrown from the airplanes in colonial Ethiopia, in wartime Ethiopia, were ostensibly authored by the Ethiopian emperor himself. But we shouldn't forget that a very important part of the opposition to the war came from the Black public sphere, from the diasporic public sphere. So the Ethiopian War had a huge impact on Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist print cultures. The reactions to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in many cases stood as a proxy for a wider attack on imperialism per se as a system and racism as its grounding ideology. This is certainly true of the Trinidadian George Padmore's intense political activism and the many books he wrote around the time of the Ethiopian War. So George Padmore was a very active Pan-Africanist. He, in a way, was one of the founders of Pan-Africanism. He seized upon the war as a way to direct metropolitan attention to the problems faced by colonized people across the world. And in the aftermath of the invasion, he co-founded the International African Friends of Abyssinia, later the International African Service Bureau, which was the forerunner of the Pan-African Association. The invasion allowed Padmore to mount a more general critique of imperialism, which, as played out in its Italian avatar, gave such a critique a transnational edge. So imperialism was seen as a transnational opponent, as a transnational enemy. He and the well-known, ultra-famous Caribbean intellectual C.L.R. James produced a periodical publication, International African Opinion, you can see on the slide, which was short-lived, but which was born in the wake of the Italian invasion. So it is undeniable that the Ethiopian War was a major catalyst in the development of Pan-Africanism, as is evident in the writings of C.L.R. James, George Padmore, and Claude McKay. So to conclude, the project centers the Italian-Ethiopian War, begun in 1935, ending, we could say, with the return of the Italian colonies in 1941. So in 1935, 1936, as the war sort of begins and ends. And in 1941, Ethiopia was handed back to the emperor. He was escorted by the British back into his territory because all of the Italian colonies fell to the British in the course of the Second World War. So this project centers the Italian-Ethiopian War as crucial in shaping the trajectories of some of the 20th century's most powerful political processes and movements: fascism, Pan-Africanism, anti-colonialism, and imperialism. As news of this event reverberated around the globe, free presses united in their attempts to interpret its meaning for the tectonic shifts in world relations between empires, colonies, races, and nations. These initial reactions established the fault lines for many of the political battles over race, imperialism, and fascism in the ensuing decades across Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. There was a huge reaction to the war in Harlem, in the United States, in Chicago, in large urban centers where there was a large Black population. As yet, we don't have one scholarly work that is devoted to excavating and analyzing the global discursive fallout of this event. Though important case studies have covered the impact on individual regions and cultural and political constituencies, its significance to world history, and especially the multiplicity of its significance to the various reading publics and activist communities across the world, remains still under-researched. Through analyzing print culture production, journals, newspapers, newsletters, ephemera, archival documents, pamphlets, literature located at sites around the world, this project hopes to offer the first multi-site global history of the Ethiopian War through print. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neelam. Now, Simona, Oberto will start the Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much from my side too for this very, very rich talk on a rather dark chapter of Italian history, and for a very complex, for a very specific view on a very complex situation. What I found particularly interesting, and that's why I'm looking at my notes, because it was there was very much I noted. And coming back to the pamphlet is you were talking about the way in which the Ethiopian authorities, in that case, the king, was trying to delegitimize Italian colonial, the Italian colonial, or fascist, we should say, colonial enterprise at that point. So, and the strategies you listed were showing that it's not a it's civilizing development. The British were supporting them and showing how criminal their procedure was, and in pointing out the atrocities. What I asked myself during the talk was, though, is this a genuine, well, I'm just, genuinely Ethiopian position, polemic position on the topic, or is it not basically a proxy for a British criticism of fascist positions? And if it is so, where is the Ethiopian point of view on the fascist procedures in Ethiopia?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Simona. It's a really good question. So it is, and it's I think there's probably more than one answer to that question. I think there is a lot of truth to what you're suggesting, that a lot of this is coming from British propaganda and British interest in the region. And Haile Selassie was, of course, a guest of His Majesty's government at the time. He was living in Bath. At the same time, he was a bit of a pariah on the international stage. Like at the time of the invasion, he gave a very moving speech at the League of Nations, and he was booed off the stage. And generally, he was subjected to racist abuse when he appeared in front of all the League of Nations delegates. So certainly some of it, especially because it was happening, through British planes, basically they were raining down the leaflets. There was an element of wanting to sort of mobilize the Ethiopian population against the Italians, but there was a very, very widespread resistance to Italian occupation as well. This was grassroots. This was, homegrown Ethiopian resistance, and those who resisted Italy's occupation were then, after the war, considered national heroes. So there's a whole narrative about the war that is mainly represented by the Amhara elite, the Amhara population. So Ethiopia is divided into different ethnic groups. One sort of dominant group has always been that of the Amhara elite, and Haile Selassie and his family belong to the Amhara elite. So they always resisted. They and their the fellow commanders and other fighting members of their family, they all resisted Italy. After the war, this became a kind of self-narrative about the Amharas, that they were the ones who had helped defeat Italy. Yeah. And it became, in some cases, almost a form of, an excuse for dominating other groups by saying, well, we fought for the country. We defended the country against foreign rule. So it's a complex story. It's not just about the British. I think it would be wrong to say that it was the Ethiopians as a united group who were against the Italian occupation, though many of them were. And Italy never entirely conquered Ethiopia, even before the British arrived. So much of the country was not under Italian control. Obviously, the Italian propaganda machine was saying that everything had been conquered and everything was under fascist rule, but it wasn't true. But I mean, recently, as talking to some Ethiopian scholars, they're saying, as I was just saying, that narrative of the resistance to Italy is very much internalized by the Amharas themselves, not by all Ethiopian groups. So it's a complex history. Like, I think what we've been trying to do in this project is to see how the external history of the war is not mirrored by the internal history and memory of this war within Ethiopia itself.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense, because that's a picture that has been conveyed, and that's why I was asking whether that might be what we could call a genuinely Ethiopian or Amhara position in that case. And if I'm allowed to ask another question, right, following this one, is there any kind of cooperation between Ethiopian intellectuals or Amhara, probably not Amhara, but Ethiopian intellectuals with the fascist regime? Would they have cooperated with them, or is there rather a strategy of trying to silence and marginalize Ethiopian voices?
Yeah, so that's also a really interesting question, because there were certainly collaborators, and there were so-called traitors, like people who did, basically sell themselves to the Italians. But the Italians had a very ruthless policy towards Ethiopians. They effected massacres, exterminations of much of the Ethiopian ruling classes. They massacred many monks as well, because obviously Ethiopia is a Coptic. I mean, there is the Ethiopian Church. It is a Christian country nominally, but that didn't stop the Italians from massacring many, many monks and many clergy in Ethiopia. So they did attack the intellectuals, and they tried to annihilate them. So they had a policy that was not unlike that of National Socialism, of German Nazi fascism, of not so much doing by indirect rule, but direct rule and annihilation of the enemy. It was an apartheid state. It wasn't a state. It was nothing like colonial India, nothing like British India where there was indirect rule. There was just a no compromise policy adopted towards the Ethiopians. Generally, Italian education in the colonies aimed to not educate the population beyond the 4th grade because they did not want to create an intellectual elite. That was just not part of the policy. It was much more in the lines of apartheid than anything else. But there were some collaborators for sure.
Oh, and this is quite the opposite of what is represented in that very famous song you probably know with Facetta Nera, right? So we're going to come, you're going to be a black shirt like us, and then we're going to give you new rules and new laws and new technology and new infrastructure and a new king. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was very different. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, Neelam, and also Simona.